Good day. I'm sort of in the kitchen today, though I sort of was about 2 months ago. Many of you will have seen, and most people on Planet Vegetaria, our Facebook group, will have seen that I did a couple of videos about making a sourdough starter in January. And one of the videos that I also recorded at that time was what you can use sourdough discard for. And one of those uses was to make a yeasted loaf. Now, a yeasted loaf is obviously a traditional loaf, but by using sourdough starter or discard from your sourdough starter, you can add a depth of flavour and a different texture to a standard yeasted loaf. Now, when I did that video, what I didn't realise is for some reason the intro, i.e. this bit, which I did 2 months ago, and also the first section of the video didn't have any sound to it. And I don't really understand why that was, because all the rest of the video does, as you will see. Anyway, it didn't. So today I finally got around to doing this intro. And I also do a voiceover for the first bit of the video that you're hopefully about to watch. And when you do make a sourdough starter, effectively that's mixing flour and water. And then each day you add more flour and water and more flour and water. And you get to a point where I think you have 350 grams of starter, sourdough starter in our case. But you don't need all of that to make a sourdough loaf. So you're left with discard from your sourdough starter. And this video is about using that remaining discard to make a loaf using traditional yeast. In this case, we use instant yeast, but you can use active yeast, which is what we normally do, and flour and additional water. The one thing that you've got to remember is there's already flour and water in your sourdough starter, so you need to remove the total amount of water in the starter and the total amount of flour in the starter from the total volumes by weight of flour and water. Anyway, I go over that, so we'll get to that in a minute. Here I have the mixing bowl, which I've put onto the scales and zeroed. And now I'm going to add in some discard from the sourdough starter. This discard will actually give the loaf, we're making a yeasted loaf here, remember, a little more depth and flavour. So if you've watched our video of how to make a sourdough starter, you use a small amount of, I think it's 350 grams to make a loaf of bread, and this is the remainder of the sourdough starter that is left over. So what's this? This is coming up to 270, 275, 274 grams. 275 grams, there we are. Now, what I'm saying here, which you can't hear because I didn't have the recording on, is that this mixture in here is basically 50% rye flour and 50% water. So we're going to be making our standard yeasted loaf using this as a basis. So if we had 274 grams of starter, that's effectively 137 grams of flour and 137 grams of water. We're going to be following our normal recipe. We'll put a link above so that you can watch that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take 137 grams away from the total amount of flour in our original recipe, and we're going to take 137 grams of water away from our original water weight. Our total water weight is 320 grams for our standard bread recipe. So 320 grams minus 137 grams, which is already in the starter, is 183 grams. So that is what I am putting in here. Then you give it a really good stir so that all of the liquid gets combined with all of the starter. So that makes a really, really loose mix. I've zeroed that again. Here we're actually going to be using an instant yeast, and this yeast is actually going to go directly into the bowl. If you were using active yeast, then what you would be doing is you would be doing what we do with active yeast. You'd be putting the active yeast into the liquid and then leaving it to activate for 15 minutes to foam up a bit before you put it into the bowl and mix it like we've done already. But in this case, we're actually going to be using instant yeast. Here we're putting in the flour. So our total amount of flour in this recipe is 550 grams. We're taking off the 137 grams that was in the starter. So we're putting in 413 grams of bread flour into here. Seem to be very accurate there. And then in goes our instant yeast. Instant yeast basically is part activated and it's smaller than normal yeast grain, so you don't have to activate it in water first. You can use it directly like this. So those are all our ingredients basically. And here we've taken it over and started mixing it in our mixer with a dough hook. So what we're doing here is just making sure that all of that is well incorporated. Not quite sure what I'm saying there, but I think I'm saying that we're going to autolyse the dough now, which is effectively leaving it for 15 minutes so that the yeast and the gluten can start working within the flour. This has now been resting for about 15 minutes. Yeah, it's looking fine. It's quite a bit softer because the yeasts have started working. We're going to mix it for 5 minutes, let it prove for an hour, mix it again for another 5 minutes, and then we're going to shape it for its final proofing. So this has been rising for about an hour. You can see it's time to come out and get it shaping. This has been knocked back in the mixer, just giving it a few turns. I'm actually going to be putting it into this proving basket. If you want to put it in a loaf tin, you can do that. If you want to free form it like we've done with the other loaves in the past, then feel free to do that. But we're going to use this proving basket. If you don't have a proving basket, you could use a bowl and put a very heavily floured tea towel inside the bowl, or you could buy one of these if you are going to be making bread on a regular basis. So I'm going to get the dough out. sprinkling of flour. It is quite wet. I used to be worried about wet dough, but the more you work with it, the more used to it you become. Right, and then it's a matter of, I bring everything, as you've seen, or you may have seen in the other bread recipe. This is all about strengthening the outside of the skin here. So we're just going to pull it in. If you're making a ball, you just carry on pulling this in, which is increasing the tension on the outside. Make sure you've got flour underneath. By pulling that in like that, you're increasing the tension. Now we want to do the same thing, but obviously we don't want a ball shape here. What we want is something longer. So I start shaping it, and then I sort of flatten it in on itself, bring it back to a sort of ball shape. And what I'm doing is each time I pull that up, I'm sort of pressing it in. Pull it up, press in, pull it up, press in. Just going to get some flour there. Again, what I'm going to do is do that. It's all about tensioning. This is going to be the final shaping. Maybe not, because I've just caught it there. Just get a bit more flour. Actually, I'm happy with that. You can hopefully see it's soft. It's pliable. It's bouncy. Now what we're going to do is flour the inside here. Make sure there's a good flouring, and then what we're doing, this is going to be turned upside down onto a hot baking tray when this goes in the oven. So we want the side where there's a seam is going to be the bottom. So we're putting that seam side up, so that when this gets turned out onto a baking sheet, a hot baking sheet, this is the bottom and down here is the top. So I'm going to let this rise for about an hour now. I'm just going to take up some of this excess flour here and just dust around the edges. As you can imagine, when this expands, so it will come up to at least sort of here, when this expands, it will obviously come against the sides here. So we want to make sure that it's well dusted on the inside with flour so that it doesn't stick. So I'm just going to pop that into a warm place at the moment for an hour. This has been rising for about an hour and is about to go in the oven. The oven is on full at the moment, which for our oven is 260 degrees centigrade, and in there is a tray which this is going to go on top of. If you remember, we're turning this out, so I'm going to get the tray out. I'm just going to move this out of the way for the moment, get the tray out and show you what we're doing. And you get the tray out, shut the door again, keep the heat in. So we're literally turning this out upside down. and giving it 3 little snips, and then it's going back in the oven straight away. I used a spray of water to spray, in this case 14 sprays of water into the oven. Now what that will do is ensure that the crust doesn't dry out too quickly, so that the bread can expand. So we're going to leave it in the oven now, 10 minutes on full, which is in our case, as I say, 260 degrees centigrade. And then I'm going to turn it down to 200 degrees for another 25 minutes. So it's going to cook at the moment for 35 minutes in total. So just taking the bread out of the oven now. And there we are. It's well cooked. Yeah, that's a yeasted loaf, but using up some sourdough starter discard. And it will have a different texture, and the crust will be a bit chewier, but it won't be. This isn't a sourdough loaf. It's a yeasted loaf using up sourdough starter discard. Here we have the final loaf sliced open. The texture is very much like a yeasted loaf, though some of those air bubbles will have actually been formed with the sourdough starter. One thing that you do notice here is that the crust is more chewy, as you'd expect in a sourdough loaf. So very happy with the outcome of this. You don't have to throw away your sourdough starter discard. You can keep it. If you don't make bread that often, you could keep that discard in the freezer. In fact, you can keep your sourdough starter in the freezer as well. We'll go over maintaining your sourdough starter in a later video. But there we are, a yeasted loaf made with sourdough starter discard. Thanks very much for watching.